Welcome to the Day in History for March 30th, day 14. Okay, today's day in history is the day that we bought Alaska, or that we agreed to buy Alaska from Russia for $7 million. Well, $7.2 million. That's a pretty good deal. So the big idea is some people can spot a good deal. So I'll let you write this down. Okay, so the people we're going to talk about today, Alexander II, who was the Tsar of Russia, which is like their king or president, and William Seward, who was the Secretary of State in America at the time. Okay, but first, let's take a look at Alaska. Now, it's kind of interesting because we talked about Alaska last week. And so we kind of talked about how big it is, how it has some really wonderful, beautiful terrain and what we call biomes, and how it's pretty cold in the wintertime. But it's also really, really, really big. Now, if we look at Alaska put on top of the map of the United States, and even compare it to Texas, now Texas is a big state, but look how big Alaska is. Okay. Alaska is 663 million square miles. And just to give you a comparison, Washington State, where we live, is only 71 million square miles. So Alaska is huge. If you do the math and see how many times Washington can fit into Alaska, you should send that to me in an email. Okay. Now, Alaska has a bunch of different biomes. Now, I mentioned this word earlier, biomes, B-I-O-M-E-S. Biomes is a way to describe different types of land that include plants and animals. And so Alaska has a few different types of biomes. At the very top, the red is the Arctic, very, very cold. It also has what we call boreal forests, which are forests that have a lot of snow. It has boreal tundra, which is forests that have lots of snow with also that frozen ground. And then there's some other biomes there as well. So it's a really diverse place. And it should be because it's huge. It is a giant, giant piece of land. Now, in the early 1800s, late 1700s, Alaska was actually owned by Russia. Now, Russia claimed it as its territory, and the earliest Russian, I wouldn't really call them settlers, but the earliest Russians that arrived there were about the mid-1700s. Like 1741, there were some Russians that went over and started trapping or looking for fur. Now, these early fur traders, similar to what happened in the Hudson Bay that we've talked about probably last year, and in the Pacific Northwest as well, there was a huge, huge market for beaver furs and all kinds of fur because that's what people were making their clothes out of. They were making their hats. And so the early Russian fur traders were the first Europeans to come there. Now, these fur traders didn't really make cities. They had few settlements, but it wasn't what we would call a permanent European settlement. So even though the Russians said they owned it, they really just had a few people up there. So, okay. Now, the current Tsar of Russia in 1867 was Alexander II. Now, he had wanted to sell this to America before the Civil War, because if you look at the date, we're in 1867, we're right after the Civil War. There had actually been talk about selling it before the Civil War, but when America's war erupted, it kind of put this deal on hold. Now, there are some historical reports that Alexander II just didn't need this land, but there's also some evidence that he actually wanted to sell it in case he lost a war with Britain, because he didn't want to have to give this land to Britain. Kind of sounds like the Louisiana Purchase. You remember with the French and the English and the Spanish and all that going on? Yeah. So when Alexander II approached the U.S., he wanted to sell it for $7.2 million. That is 2 cents an acre. 2 pennies an acre. Crazy cheap. Now, we move on to the Secretary of State, William Seward. Now, he agreed to this deal. He thought it was a good deal, but not very many other people did. And it was actually called Seward's Folly. Now, folly means like a mistake, right? And it was ridiculed as a really bad deal. It almost didn't pass Congress it passed by one vote. It was close to getting denied. But they went ahead and purchased it anyway. And for quite a while, it was kind of a joke. Now, when they made this deal, they sold the land. They didn't really have any towns to give over. And because there wasn't much up there, the U.S. Navy actually had to go up and, I guess, enforce American sovereignty or American ownership up there. But there wasn't really very many people up there, so it wasn't that difficult. Now, when the newspapers and the people heard about this purchase, they thought it was a bad deal. This cartoon right here is trying to get votes from the people in Alaska. There weren't any, so they tried to get the polar bears to vote. Get it? The bear vote. Okay, so it was a joke. Now, here's another political cartoon where America's buying a giant ice cube for $7 million. Who would want to buy an ice cube for $7 million? People didn't think it was a good deal. Now, here's another political cartoon with the czar saying, look at all this beautiful land, look at, and in the background, it's a bunch of icebergs and polar bears. People thought it was a really bad deal. Now, all of that changed in 1896. Because you know what they found up there? They found a lot of gold. Now, if there's one thing that'll change people's minds really quick, it's a whole lot of free money. Now, all of this gold was discovered, and almost overnight, over 100,000 prospectors or people looking to get this gold started moving up to Alaska. About 30 to 40,000 of them actually made it there, but there was a significant amount of gold that was found, and it made the purchase of Alaska all of a sudden seem like a really, really good idea. Now, these towns popped up overnight, and this was a gold rush, and it was some difficult terrain. I mean, if we look at the pipeline was pretty tough to build, but can you imagine doing this in 1896? It was pretty tough, but you could also go to streams, and if you got lucky, you could literally pull hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the water. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me, right? So, all of a sudden, Seward's Folly, that was joked about, ridiculed, thought as a bad deal, all of a sudden was like, oh, wow, that was a really good idea. And we're not even going to talk about the fact that later on, we found massive amounts of oil, or the huge natural resources that we haven't even started using yet. Now, on top of that, we also get some of the most beautiful land in our country. And it's a delicate balance between understanding that as humans, we have fundamental human needs for resources such as oil and gold and metals and timber and wildlife and all these things that we need to function. And also the fact that this is a huge amount of land that humans really haven't touched. And it's a really good idea to focus on the balance between what we need and what we need to protect. And Alaska is one of those places that we really need to focus on. So, today's day in history, the big idea, some people can spot a good deal. Alaska for $7.2 million at 2 cents an acre, I think was a pretty good deal.